The tall, human-like figure moved about the thick trees with no struggle at all. It was as if it was floating. It made no noise, and the only movement seen was the creature lunging forward. It was graceful, yet terrifying. My eyes grew as I watched it skim over a frozen lake and back onto the trees. I tried to make out its facial features, but I couldn't. Perhaps it was the fog or my lack of concentration. I was just relieved that I hadn't seen its face, though I tried. I'm sure it was just as horrifying as the tentacle-like bones extruding from the creature's back. Time stood still, and I froze the closer I got to it. Why was I approaching this thing anyway? That, I still don't know. Something about it was inviting though. Something about it made me want to come to it. My heart was pounding at a fast rate, but my legs were moving faster as I chased the creature. It turned a sharp corner and I turned right behind it, but stopped myself, dead in my tracks, when I saw that it had stopped itself. In front of it was a small girl, around 9 years of age. She stared up at it in horror, and I feared for her life as well as mine. I tried to wave her off, but to no avail. She seemed captivated by the creature's appearance the way I had been. She slowly stood up, and as she did, I fell back and crawled beneath a bush. I couldn't look away, and all I did was watch. The creature brought its face close to hers, and as it did, her eyes grew, and she began to shake, covering her eyes. She was terrified, and compared to her, I had nothing to be afraid of. She was only inches away from the being, and she was now looking at it face to face. I'd never seen someone take in something and consider it deeply, and yet have such terror in their eyes. The little girl fell, but as I took a closer look, I could see a small chest filling in with air and releasing. She wasn't dead, but she was unconscious. I took a closer look at it, and from my observations, I concluded that the being's gender was male. It took her and dragged her behind it. He was slowly creeping ahead this time, and I felt the need to follow. So of course I did so with no hesitation. I was at the point that I couldn't even think. After several minutes of following, he stopped at a clearing. The trees that surrounded the empty area were draped with ropes and nooses, mutilated bodies, and limbs were hanging from them. One body had been hung slowly, I could tell. The fingers of what once looked remotely human had been clawing at its own throat, trying to break free from the noose. What was this? There had to be at least 30 murders committed here. I looked in terror at my surroundings. Guts hanging from torn skin, people with gouged out eyes. I began to panic, and as soon as I felt tears streaming down my face, then I turned my attention to the girl. The poor girl had been gutted in the short amount of time it took for me to realize where we were at. Her eyes were gone, and her limbs had been cut off, but the creature was gripping the stubs to slow the bleeding. I only cried harder when I saw her working, yet displaced lungs, and her beating heart. Everything was still working because nothing had been removed fully. She was still alive. That's when, with one movement, the creature ripped her heart away from what was keeping it beating. I gagged and almost vomited, but stopped myself. I couldn't let this happen to me, not like all those other people had. I couldn't let myself be heard, but my body was frozen, so I couldn't turn around and run away. He then hung what was left of her body up from a rope. The surrounding trees had died. I'd noticed. He stopped all movement while hanging the child's left arm up. He knew of my presence, and he quickly turned around and faced me. Terror took over. I tried to let out a scream for help, but I couldn't. I knew this is what death himself looked like. I saw nothing. He was faceless. He had no face, and yet he was the most terrifying thing I'd ever laid eyes on. Right as he turned, I heard a faint shrieking noise. A very loud, ear-piercing buzzing. The kind you hear from a TV that's lost service and shows nothing but static. And in hearing this, I saw what seemed to look like static as well. Everything around me began to spin and blur into nothing but black. Though, before it did, the creature revealed to me that he did have a mouth. And how he did this still pains me to think about. How he showed no pain, but instead a murderous grin. The pale skin that should have been a face slowly stretched until it ripped open in the form of a mouth. Parts of skin were still intact, and the skin on the corners of his newfound mouth ripped upwards to form a contorted smile. I knew I was seeing what that girl had seen, and I knew I was hearing what she'd heard as well. I was now unconscious, and I knew for sure I wouldn't wake up.